So I want to welcome all of you all and thank you all for being here. And they told me that this panel is going to be based in part on an article that this dude wrote about me. And essentially, I want to try to clarify like what I actually stand for, because reading that article is not at all clear. So let me just be very clear, given this topic, what it is that I actually believe, and hopefully it would help in the discussion. The first thing is, like, I have never, nor will I ever, support state-sponsored, sorry. So I'll start over, not the other part, but just this. I do not now, nor have I ever, supported state-sponsored or supported subordination of black people and other people of color in this country. Racial segregation, or segregation as people call it, is only one manifestation of that subordination. I have always, and I always will, fight against any type of effort that is used to support white supremacy. And I believe that legal separation in this country, legal apartheid in this country, was one part of a way to promote white supremacy in America. So I want to be clear, because people are, oh, he's for segregated schools. No, you all are using these terms as if they don't have real meaning, if they don't have any history in this country. So I want to be clear about where I stand on that position. The second thing is that my concerns about this topic are focused on the realities of the people that Howard Thurman called the disinherited. And these are the people who are poor. These are the people, as Howard Thurman said, with their backs constantly against the wall, the disinherited. And so when I approach this issue, it is approaching it from the standpoint of what is it that is happening to these people. And the third thing is that I actually believe that pursuing a strategy of integration in this country, if it works, it's good, do it. If you see it as like a plausible strategy, why would I say don't do that? If you think if you figured out a way to integrate people racially and economically, I would be a fool to sit up here and say, oh, no, don't do that. I would never oppose that. But what I'm trying to say to people is that while y'all are saying that, many of y'all moved, white people moved, which is the reason why there is no, quote, integration. And then you out there in the suburbs hollering at us about integration. And so from my standpoint, the issue is, how do a people survive under circumstances that have been oppressive for as long as we've been here? And so what I'm trying to suggest is this notion that you have to either be for integration or against integration, and that defines you as a person, is ludicrous. Because the one thing that I know about black people in this country, if we only got one option for anything, we in deep trouble. So as long as y'all sort of understand that, I think I want to go on to say that I do not believe that the body politic in this country writ large cares about black people and other people of color. Not just about education, but about nothing. Because the reality of it is that for many of these children that we say that we care about, the fact that their families don't have health care, the fact that their families don't have decent housing, the fact that their families can't get decent jobs, that has more impact on their education lives, frankly, than segregated schools. And so in the final analysis, the question really is, what does this country think about us? And it is a hoax. It is a hoax to say that what we're going to do is put the onus for integration in America on schools. We're not going to do nothing about housing. We're not going to do nothing about economics. We're not going to do anything about any other thing, but somehow in America, we're going to integrate schools. It was a hoax in the beginning. It's a hoax now. And then, so the final thing I want to say is that Derek Bell made a point that I think is really essential to this discussion. He said that the foundation of people who are integration all the time and only integration is that the actual presence of white children is said to be essential. That blacks must gain access to white schools because, quote, equal educational opportunity means integrated schools. And because only school integration will make certain that black children will receive the same education as white children. This theory of school desegregation, however, fails to encompass the complexity of achieving equal educational opportunity for children to whom it has long been denied. And then finally, so many people talk about the Brown decision and ain't never read it, number one. And number two, have never looked at footnote 11, where all of the social science literature is at least four of the critical studies, even though there's a whole brief on nothing but social science literature that was used as a basis for reaching the conclusion that something that is all black is inherently unequal. The person I want you all to remember is Robert Carter. Judge Robert Carter was the lawyer who had the responsibility to put the social science literature before the court. And in Derek Bell's book, Shades of Brown, Robert Carter says that if he had to do all over again, he would have gone to black educators instead of black social psychologists to find out what is the definition of equal educational opportunity. And the second thing that he says is that if you were to ask him, is integration the ultimate solution in America, he would say yes. But what he would also say is that is essentially a middle-class black people issue. Because middle-class black people are the ones who, if schools don't work for their kids, just like white people, schools don't work, you can move, right. You can put your kids in private schools, or you can get the most expensive tutoring on the planet. And you can do all three. But if you poor, and you black, and you brown, and you living in America, you don't have those options. You do not have those options. And it is ludicrous for people who have watched black and brown children have poor schools in their communities forever. And now a charter school comes in, or some other school comes in, and provides a quality education, and y'all talking about, but it's not integrated. Where were y'all when all of this happened? Where were you when these schools were producing nothing for our children in our community? Where was all your outrage then? And so I just want y'all to know, I'm outraged. I've been outraged. I'm gonna never not be outraged. And my being outraged is the fact that we gotta listen to y'all lecture us on the importance of integration when you have shown by your movement that you will never give in to anything that won't better your own children. And I won't either.
Let me bring the panel up. That was amazing, Howard, of course. And as I'm getting Lloyd and Candice set up, I want to state the obvious. I'm not black. But I have been a friend and a follower of Howard Fuller for a really long time. And every single time I hear him, he energizes me. And this discussion, really beyond the article, is taking place everywhere around the country, that there are schools being set up largely by people of color to support communities. And we at the Center for Education Reform get this echo from legislators, Republican and Democrat, about why we would let this happen, why we are not doing more to infuse these good things in traditional schools. And the point is, there is a bit, as we've talked about, a lifesaver approach to this. There's also a systemic approach, which is when you build the school and create a great school, you change the community. And so this is a discussion to take off of what Howard said. How do we fix this? Right? Instead of wringing our hands, how do we fix this so that anyone who wants to open an innovative entrepreneurial endeavor in America, whoever shows up that is needy and wants that they are served without these side issues, if you will, that don't get to the heart of the fundamental issue, as Howard said. So immediately to my left is Candice Burns, rock star, Chief Communications Officer, Friendship Public Charter Schools, Washington, D.C., the first network in Washington, D.C., actually the first network of color created anywhere in the country. They now have upwards of 12 schools around the country. And
in D.C.
In D.C., that's
In
right.
DC
And you're in...
We're in Arkansas,
Right.
3 in Arkansas, and 2 in Louisiana.
Fantastic. So she brings a tremendous amount of experience in this endeavor. Lloyd Knight with T.C. Howe, Thomas Carr Howe Community High School in Indianapolis.
Yes, ma'am.
And he has a veteran educator originally from North Carolina and is leading a school that was actually taken over or converted to a independent public school by the state because it was doing so poorly. And then, of course, we've met Howard. So I want to actually go to you, Lloyd, because when we were talking about this panel, you said something that struck me as so just, I guess, simple, but incredibly the most important thing, which is that educators of color inspire students of color to go into teaching. And if we don't have students of color in great schools, where would they ever have access to have great aspirations for future?
Well, you said something so impactful. Once again, of course, thank you for allowing me to be here today. Our company, Noble Education Initiative, has done a lot of great work in the area of integration. One of the things that we definitely focus on now is just making sure that as far as an organization, we're starting tomorrow, the State Board of Education is going to vote for us to start our own transition to teaching program around the idea of making sure that we can continue to recruit African American educators and people of the community. One startling statistic that most people don't know is that only 2% of schools within our country employ African American males as educators. And we want to make sure that our students, based on the research that's already out there that says that students who are educated by African American males and definitely people of their own community perform better academically, which is something that is a little bit stark different than what most people think about when they talk about education and African Americans, because many times we're placed in disciplinary roles, culture roles. But there is an academic impact that is able to be had by organizations investing in the recruitment and the retention of African Americans in lead education roles, whether it be teachers, assistant principals, principals, or superintendents.
And what did you think of Howard's comments about this whole debate?
Well, I agree with him in so many different areas. When you talk about integration and charter schools when they enter communities, I feel like in many instances in the past, many charter organizations haven't necessarily thought about the makeup of how their teachers are. So I'll give you an example. I'm from Chicago. And in Chicago, many public schools are almost all exclusively African American, while charter schools are almost exclusively Caucasian or of different races. And I think many of that just comes from the fact that we have community schools, they're already in place and embedded in communities in Chicago for many years. And when you're newcomers, we have to also consider those factors. How can we bring the community into the school when we enter the schools, like Dr. Fuller said a second ago, instead of coming in and just saying, we're going to go ahead and just hire our people. We're going to omit the fact that there were people here who are intelligent and smart and work hard and want to be great educators and want to help sustain the community. The best thing about turning around schools, especially like the work we've done at TC Howe, is that when you are focused in on high school students and you can push them through high expectations, Noble Education Initiative, just making sure that our students are always on the ball and following directions and being great, when you create that, it permeates out through the community. So you have that cycle you're talking about, where you produce great educators as students in your school, and you continue to push the message of you're going to go, and instead of us telling you you're going to go out into the community and be great, we want you to leave, come back, and reinvest into the community through education.
So Candice, there are these academic articles written. Howard referred to the one that was written about him and his views. They're all over. There's this debate about, what kind of schools, what kind of composition, who runs them, governance. Does the community really care?
They absolutely care. And so what I would say about friendship, and I have to tell you, I am friendship's #1 fan. I love talking about friendship because essentially its history, it's 21-year strong history. Its founding, its roots, founded by just really a dynamic, I would say, education advocate and child advocate, Donald L. Hentz, its CEO, Patricia Brantley. Its origins, which really was founded by the people of the district for the children of the District of Columbia. And all of that matters because you've got to have roots and you've got to have relationships and you've got to have buy-in from the communities in which you are dedicated to serve. If you don't have that, I suspect you might not be there very long. And so that's what makes friendship unique. They were started by the district, and when I tell you, we know the block, we know the parents on the block, we know the representatives who speak for the parents on the block. Any kid that walks in our offices, we know them, we know their relatives. We really take the time to get to know our children and our families. And that combined with what I think is just a dynamic academic program truly makes a difference. So yes, community matters.
And those community members, though, think this conversation is important, like who's coming to my kid's school? Or they just look at your school and go, this is a great school, I want to be there.
You know, I think it's a combination a combination of both. You know, this whole hashtag representation matters. Representation actually matters. But representation is just a few things, right? It's not just the race of the individuals who run the school, the race of the teachers who are driving it. It's the expertise of the staff who are there, right? It's the gender equity that's there. All of those things play a part, and parents are looking at this, they're assessing it, and they're making decisions based on those things. You know, something else too, oftentimes I feel as if people think that parents from a certain economic background are not as in tune and focused on the future of their kids. That is absolutely not the case. Our parents are in our buildings, they are quizzing us, they are grilling us, they are keeping us accountable, and we want them to keep us accountable. So, absolutely.
Okay, so Howard, let me bring you into this. We've been having this discussion about the way charter schools that are started in predominantly minority communities for kids of color are treated by foundations, are treated by lawmakers. And to Candice's point, I had a discussion, transparently I will share this, because I've written about it, with the head of the DC Public Charter Board, who, when I said to him, why do you have to score schools only on math and reading compared to the average of what kids should be, which is completely irrelevant if you happen to be in Ward 7 or 8 or in the middle of Indianapolis or Milwaukee, about how we are progressing, and he said, we have to do it because parents just don't know how to make choices. And of course, I wanted to spit out my Caesar salad at that point, at that lunch. What would you have said to that, Howard? And how do we handle this going forward?
You shouldn't ask me that. If I could do this, Jeanne, I want to take your question and I want to talk about it in a slightly different way. So for years, I kept, as I've given speeches, I kept trying to explain, like, people who are trying to be free need to be a critical part of defining their freedom. Because one of the things about being black in America is we came out of slavery understanding that we had been liberated, but we weren't free. And that what we thought was that education was going to be a critical instrument to us actually becoming free. And so what we did was we didn't have all of what we needed at that point. So two groups of white people descended upon us, the missionaries and the corporate people, the industrialists. Each one of them had their own view about what kind of education we needed. But what they didn't understand was that we wanted to be helped, not be controlled. So that when we think about this issue, and I know this is off of your question, but I gotta get this in. When you think about this issue, many white people feel that black people are like a drag on America. And so one of the things that if we're not going to be, quote, a drag on America, we have to build our communities. The way you strengthen communities is by having institutions that are able to become strong. One of the critical institutions are educational institutions. So while I love the fact that KIPP comes in and Aspire comes in, all these people come in, the issue is how does that strengthen black people's control over their destiny? And so therefore, it is critical that we not only have good schools, but that we have good schools that are governed and not by black people, not just the principal, but the owners, the board, the people who determine policy, because that is what sustains institutions. And so white people who are investing in us, and we have many allies and friends, all of whom I love, at some point in time, we have to ask, how is it that after all of these years, the major institutions out here that run this stuff are all controlled by white people? And so at some point in time, the transition has to be made, or we're no different than all of these other institutions that continue to define our lives. And that's what leads to a question like that, right? Because people are not looking at it from the standpoint that I'm trying to look at it in terms of the survival and the progression of a people. And the role that institutions play in making that happen.
Candice, want to add into that?
Well, the one thing that what you're saying makes so much sense because, of course, like I've been a superintendent of schools in North Carolina, different things like that, and in most instances with our boards, they usually make up a lot. For the vast majority of our schools, we have 87 schools across many states, make up what the community typically looks like. But when you're talking about coming into inner cities, Indianapolis, when you're talking about Louisiana, I know that my organization has worked really hard to make sure that they have diverse boards and different things like that. When you're talking about charter management organizations as a whole, and we're talking about diversity, the truth is that at the principal level, we all really want to have diverse schools, because I think principals and coaches and assistant principals see the value in it. What Dr. Fuller is saying is that this is truly a call to action for any CMOs in the building, anybody who's a superintendent in the building, that you can have great success with African Americans leading your schools in various different levels, and that you should be able to trust us to elevate to the upper levels where we can be a CEO, where we can be on boards that are governing our schools as well. And that trust comes from management organizations that are willing to invest those resources, not just lip service, true resources to say, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to create opportunities where we're going to go into other universities, whether it's an HBCU or predominantly white institution. We're going to go out there and we're not going to just say, hey, we don't have any candidates. We're going to go get them. I'd like to just tell a quick story. I've been to 3 hiring fairs this year as a principal. And in all 3 of them, there were hundreds of candidates. Teach for America, ITF, which are independent transition teaching organizations. In all those instances, there was either 1 or 2 black male candidates who were on the docket to be interviewed by everyone there. The sad truth, in the TFA one, the young man didn't show up. And in the other one, it was 1 person with about 15 SMOs trying to all get to that person at the same time. When we don't recruit what we need for our schools, our students suffer. So we have to, as all of our charter management organizations are in here, hear my call when I say we have to step up our efforts to recruit within our communities, and furthermore, African American males within our schools, because there is success to be had for our students.
Well, and this is the conversation we were having also with Candice, your CEO, Pat Brantley, on the phone, who said, this is why we need to put the school first and the community first, because if you can educate these students well, they are going to look positively at you, at Donald, and other people that lead these schools and say, maybe I should go into this field. And when we don't put that first, when we don't support it, when we don't expand it and promote it, there's a we fall off, right? We don't do what we intended.
I certainly can speak from the perspective of friendship. We've got some upwards of, let's say, almost 3,000 alumni at this point over the 21-year span we've been serving young people. And it is amazing to see these same young people who have gone to our Woodridge Elementary and Middle School, then they go on to our collegiate high school, then they go on to college. They still have these bonds and relationships with our educators. They admire them. They see them as mentors. They go on and go to graduate school, and then they come back to friendship, and they become teachers. They're instructional specialists. This can happen. Representation matters. Also, being intentional matters. It's not that difficult. It really isn't. You just have to have a mindset that we're going to have a workforce that represents the students that we serve. We're going to have a workforce that represents the world in which they live. And once you do that, you go to those HBCUs, you go to those top-notch education programs, you go to even those niche education programs, you build referral programs, you find ways to bring that diversity of our society and of that neighborhood, you bring that into our schools. So absolutely, it can be done.
So I referred earlier to a big elephant in the room all the time, which is accountability. I mean, who doesn't want great schools, right? And wants to be able to say, gosh, this is the best school in the world. The problem is we figured out over the last 15 years, and I'm a huge fan of accountability, that it's not easy to measure what's successful for someone's student, right? And as Howard alluded to, I might send my child to a private school, and that success is not on paper somewhere, but you can see it through the progression of years and years and years, et cetera. So one of the things that Black-led, in particular, charter schools have experienced, and Howard, I wonder if you can address this, is this notion of, well, it's an average school and it doesn't look great after 3 or 4 years on you name the performance metrics that the state has created. By the way, it's very comfortable for the state to have this and be able to look at one lens. And there's not a lot of complexity to it, sadly, anymore. So we want to put you on notice. You had some amazingly successful schools, and then you had 2 or 3 at one time that were on average, and I would go around Washington, D.C., and people would say, Friendship isn't doing so well. I'd say, excuse me? And so this notion of backfilling came up at one point in time, and a lot of the schools in the same communities were not taking kids after day one. And I'll never forget your boss saying to me, we take Mrs. Smith's kids on November 5th, on November 12th, on February 3rd, like it doesn't matter. And that has an impact. So what do we do about this, guys? What do we do about the fact that you're not getting the $10 million grants immediately unless you promise to do X, Y, and Z over 5 years, that somebody who has been not backfilling, just not criticizing, there's a room for everybody, but this bothers me, and we only have 12 minutes, and I want to solve this, particularly when this is partly sponsored by lots of great foundations who do support these institutions but could do more. This is a problem. There are hundreds and hundreds of people out there leading great schools that no one pays attention to because they don't show up here, or they don't present at a conference, or they don't have the strategic business plan that, by the way, I can't even afford to do at my organization. So what do we do about that inequity that is preventing these schools from growing?
We do different. You know what I'm saying is that the interesting thing, the longer I live, the more I realize how much people want change as long as nothing changes. And that, you know, there's all of this discussion about diversity, which is important, but there ain't no discussion about the transfer of power. Yes. And so at a certain point in time, if y'all not talking about that, I'm tired of listening to y'all talk about how important it is to be diverse. It's cool to be diverse, but you in the room and you the diversity, but what you say don't mean jack, because you ain't got no power to affect nothing. And so at a certain, but there's another side to that, is that if you do get in the room, we have a responsibility not to just be happy that they invited us in there. Because if you're gonna get in the room and you ain't gonna say nothing, you ain't gonna do nothing, then what good is it for you to be in the room? Because I gotta say that, because I'm sitting here saying it is critical for us to have black governed, black led institutions. But if you read The Color of School Reform by Jeffrey Hennick, and they talk about why is it that, it was even when my wife was superintendent of Detroit, they did an analysis of these 5 school districts that were controlled by black people, and the question was, how come black children are not learning? Because one of the realities is that these institutions are not just about education, they're about economics. And so there's a class issue that has to be addressed along with the racial issue that we're talking about. And so for us to be, but let me get to this point, is that I have been in rooms and I have seen young white people who I care who have not done nothing and they get millions of dollars. A black or brown person walk in the room and they send you through 50 million hoops before you can even say hello. And so then when you call people on it, well, we got standards. No, what y'all got is giving money to people you know in your, it's that social capital thing that we don't have. And we're supposed to act like that ain't happening. We're supposed to sit there like, oh, that's not really happening. No, it is happening. And so it's happening at all different levels. It's happening as how we judge schools. It's happening how we fund schools. It's happening as to who we see as important. Who is it we see as smart? Michelle Foster wrote this book, Black Teachers Talk About Teaching. And she was talking about what she called elders and veterans and novices. And they were talking about integration. Like this one lady had been teaching in South Carolina, I think for 40 years or something like that. And what she said was that when integration came, 3 things happened. Black schools were closed, black teachers lost their jobs, and black teachers' opinions were devalued. When education reform came, 3 things happened. Black schools were closed, black teachers lost their jobs, and black teachers' opinions were devalued. Because what it says to me is no matter what the strategy is for reform, somehow our interests get lost in the process. It gets lost in the funding, it gets lost in how people describe what's good. Whatever it is, somehow our stuff ain't good enough. And I'm gonna just say, last weekend I just decided, look, I gotta go back and read Du Bois. So I went back and reread Souls of Black Folks. And he talked about it in 1903, man. And the rendition of the book I read came out in 1969. So Nathan Hare and Alvin Poussin had a forward in it, right? And so what they did was to take Du Bois's words from 1903 and update it to 1969. I took Du Bois's words in 1903 and updated to 2019. And what I'm telling you is the fundamentals of our oppression remains the same. And so the reason why we have so much frustration is because some of us don't even know what's happening to us, and some of us know that this is happening. But you're trying to figure out how do you negotiate this so you can survive. So let me just end this by saying that we will never solve this problem, Jeanne, if number one, we're not brutally honest about the power differential, how that operates in American society, and the way that white supremacy works in America, and all of the different tentacles that it has.
What do you say, Candice?
So this conversation is so desperately needed, and I see it in 2 parts. Oftentimes when I'm on a panel or a conversation with someone about charters, it's us versus them. And I think, number one, if we can start talking about charter schools differently, I mean, the idea that this is along the legacy of self-determination, creating institutions that uplift and sustain our communities, that educate our young people. If we can change how we're talking about opportunity, because that's what it's about. Equity really is all about options. I have 2 sons, 3 and 5, and I simply want to prepare them to seize options. And that's what every other parent wants. So changing the conversation around charters starts with conversations like this. Number 2, when it comes to supporting African-American-led organizations, who in the room is going to do something different? Friendship is amazing, but I can tell you, for maybe the $3,000 we have per pupil, our counterpart in the city has at least 5 or 6.
The private money, you mean?
Yes. And what we could do across our schools if we had those few $1,000s. Foreign language from pre-K 3 to 12. Study abroad programs, starting in middle school on for all of what we couldn't do for our students. So funding equity, and for me as a communications person, changing how we talk about opportunity.
And you had also an example where You get frequently called to come take over a failing school in another place. And Pat said to me, why wouldn't they just call and say, why don't you start a new school? Why are we always taking over the failing? You don't, that invitation is almost like we're the rescue people, but we can start great schools. We have. It's a kind of a double standard.
I agree. And what about this? You know, they didn't fail yesterday. Okay? There's been something that's happening progressively along the way. And so what are we doing? And we even think about this at Friendship. How are we going to marshal our resources so that we can support some of our sister schools out here? Because when all of us succeed, we all benefit, right? So how can we support some of our schools? Because we've got a lot of lessons learned over 21 years. And how can we impart those resources to schools who perhaps have not been doing it as long or are facing some of the challenges that we've overcome?
That's right. Lloyd?
So I think so much of what you're saying is just amazing when you're talking about like people taking a chance and giving up the resources necessary for students to really truly have a chance to be successful. Everywhere I've gone in education, as a charter school principal or as a state turnaround principal now, our equity is always in the schools that I've been in have been in a stark contrast from other places. I like to tell a quick story from when I was in grad school at DePaul. I was once in a financial education class, and we looked at the inequities of my school on the far south side of Chicago, CICS Lloyd Bond back then. We were getting about maybe $6,000 per student, while 10 miles away in Four Corners in Illinois, there was a school that was getting $25,000 per student. And in our project, we actually saw what does $25,000 look like for a school and what does $6,000 look like for us. And I know what $6,000 looks like. And the truth is that during that time, I had a discussion with someone in my classroom, and the person said, I'm fine with your students not getting what my students are going to get in Four Corners because I've worked hard to buy my house and live where I am, and that's what it is. And what I told him is that my kids in the far south side of Chicago may one day go and find out what life is like in Four Corners. And I hope that we have education necessary where our students have been fed with the things they need and our schools have been fed with the things they need so that our students can become great and amazing citizens in society. But understanding that inequity means so much to my students that if they had that, even a quarter more of that, their education experience would change completely.
So at the core of the notion of power, obviously it starts lots of places, but in education, a parent having the power to dictate where their student goes and therefore where their money goes, typically known as choice, I like opportunity better, happens in districts like New York, it happens in places like Louisiana, it's obviously with charters, obviously with vouchers, of which everybody up here has been involved or supportive at one point. But the New York Times reporter who calls up and says, after Randy Weingarten, the head of the MAFT last year, said that charter schools are the polite cousin of segregation, and why do you think it's okay for parents to have these choices and end up in an all-black school? What do we say next time that reporter calls and says something like that? What is the narrative? Because everyone here needs a message as they try to also solve the solution.
Yeah, I think a part of the narrative is that when the Brown decision passed, there were no charter schools. So that in fact, the system that was legally segregating black children was the traditional public school system, number one. Number two, the interesting thing about being black is that I've been oppressed by the private sector and the public sector. Ain't none of these sectors devoid of racism. So don't talk to me about I should only have one option when we all know that to have a single option in your life, especially if you're black or brown in this country, that puts you even further away. We never fought to only have one option. And no system, no one system in this country is best for all of our children. Randy Weingarten knows that. Anybody with any sense knows that. And they think we're stupid, that somehow we can't figure that out. So my message is very clear. Our parents need options. They need great schools. They need all kinds of schools, and they need the power to access what works best for their children. And if those people who are fighting against this, they would never give up these options for their own children. And then the last question to ask the reporter is, where do your kids go to school?
I was just about to go, yes.
Lloyd?
I think quickly I would pretty much say that any parent who's been a part of a Noble Education school, Charter School USA school within our inner cities, I would be shocked to hear them complain about the services in the charter school that we have provided to the students. Many times their voices aren't really heard. Our charter parents, I remember in Chicago, we put 25,000 people on in Chicago to advocate for school choice. So to hear from them, I think, is really important.
Okay. Candice, last word.
Quickly, if you really care about equity, if you really care about opportunity for all of our children, then deal with the real problem, okay? Equity is about, can I send my kid to the neighborhood school? Can my child that lives east of the river have the same education as the kids that live in upper Northwest? So don't talk about segregation when, frankly, our public schools are already segregated. And secondly, I would ask that person, can your child wait?
Can your child wait?
Can your child wait until that failing school down the street gets its act together? Or can we work together to build up our schools and to create new opportunities?
Can your child wait? That's why you're Chief Communications Officer. I love that. Because it's authentic and it's right, and that should be the question we ask. Thank you so much, Howard, Lloyd, Candice, for doing what you do, and to all of you. Appreciate it.